Hi, this is Tony Levin of King Crimson, and you're listening to the Modern Musicology podcast.
You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, music lovers, and welcome to Modern Musicology. Alan is otherwise engaged playing with his band tonight, so I, Anthony, get the privilege of hosting. And with me this evening, I have the most wonderful co-hosts, Steph.
Hello, everybody.
And Rob.
Sup.
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 We hope everyone is staying safe in these crazy times. As we're recording, we are coming to the end of a week of storms across most of the southern and eastern US. So we hope that you're all being safe. And we realize that with some of our recent guests, we have picked up a few more listeners. So if this is your first time listening to a brand new episode without any interviewees, welcome. We're very pleased to have you. And we hope that you find the three of us as interesting as you found Tony Levin or the guys from Heart or anyone else that we've had recently.
Yeah.
So this episode, we are talking about 2 and 3 hit wonders. Most people are well aware of the curse of the one-hit wonder. Think from more recent times, someone like Gautier, right, with somebody I used to know. But some artists actually manage to get a little more success than that and manage to have 2 or 3 before they are relegated to obscurity outside of the top 40 or top 100. So we're going to focus on those. And where I really want to start this discussion is, firstly, how would you define a 2 or 3 hit wonder? Because as I was looking through some examples, some of them are very well-established artists. I mean, technically, on a US basis, you could label Deep Purple as a 2-hit wonder.
Yeah.
Which is wild. So what kind of makes an artist a 2 or 3 hit wonder? And why do they not seem to quite have the staying power to make them a more established chart act? So I'm just going to kind of open it up to the floor on that.
So my criteria was I looked at sort of jumping out of the gate, sort of like American chart success or just general familiarity to the average listener who's not us, right? So, picking a band, they've got 2 or 3 hits. That does not mean that the rest of their catalog is awful. It just means they've only had 2 or 3 hits that resonated into the popular realm. That could be because, they're a band that just, had a soundtrack song that did well. It could be a band that did a change of pace and just did a really poppy record. It also could be that no offense, Steph, but the record label wasn't smart enough to think of singles after the second or third single, and they just lost traction on the album.
Right.
That's kind of where I'm coming at from.
I mean, I am kind of the same. I was looking at the charts, and I was mostly focused on the U.S. charts. I mean, biased because I am from America, and those are the songs that I know. But I was noticing that some of the acts I was picking tonight do have more success, like say in the UK or whatever. But I was generally trying to go by the US, like Billboard top 100, and some I did like top 40. That was sort of my.
And I had to take a similar approach. I mean, growing up in the UK, there are bands that I think were wildly successful. And here they only had 2 or 3 hits. All Saints are a great example of that, as were Bananarama.
Oh, yes. They are on my list. Exactly.
They're on my list.
We can come back to them and talk about those in a minute. But having to almost look at it from a different lens, because I grew up in a different country.
Yeah.
And I had to think, well, I'm sure we have listeners across the globe at this point, but certainly all 4 of us who host this show are based in the US. And I think we have a predominantly US-based audience.
Right. So
I had to kind of refocus that and take it away from my UK roots and start thinking about it from a more US-centric perspective.
Yeah.
I know we want to get into some examples. So, and Rob, I know you're normally very well prepared for this. So, Rob, why don't you take it away with a couple of your favorite 2 or 3 hit wonders?
I'm taking this in directions that probably neither of you were expecting.
Uh-oh.
I'm looking back. I mean, I went back to like my childhood and started looking through 45s and things, right, as well. Steph, you will probably remember this, and Alan will. Anthony, I don't think you've heard of the Hudson Brothers, but the Hudson Brothers were absolutely huge in the 70s. They were just like long hair, mustaches. They just looked like they fell out of the smoke shop, right? But they had a huge hit in "So You Are a Star," and then another one in "Rendezvous," and then nothing else, right? But they sold tons of records. And the other one is, and this is going to sound really weird, the Ozark Mountain Daredevils. Jackie Blue was like everywhere when I was a kid.
Totally.
And you still hear it, right? And then they have another track called Heaven. But Jackie Blue was like this huge record. And they are one of those bands that has a huge cult following. They're a band that has a pretty big catalog of albums, and people tend to like their albums more than their singles, which is, I think, another thing you have to weigh in too. Is this a band that normally does albums, right, rather than singles? So those are two. I kind of wanted to go to this. A lot of these I found were in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. So I kind of wanted to go back a little bit to the 70s and just stuff I remember hearing a little bit as a kid.
Yeah.
And I thought, looking at this, I thought that the Ozark Mountain Daredevils had like a huge, huge back catalog of singles, but they didn't. And I was really surprised about the Hudson Brothers because literally, in the mid 70s, they were everywhere. So that kind of surprised me as well.
And sorry to interrupt, Rob. I did want to focus on that because you raised a good point about albums versus singles, which I think is why you get some of those very well-established bands. And I'm specifically looking at Deep Purple here, who technically you could say are a two-hit wonder with Smoke on the Water and Hush. But they have so many very successful albums that are absolutely fantastic, but they were predominantly an album-focused band.
Yep.
Whereas, when you start looking at kind of more traditional pop acts who you would expect to do a lot better with singles and see ones of those that are 2 or 3 hit wonders, it starts to get a bit more interesting.
Also depends on the era too, because the single in the 80s and the 90s was a big deal. Now it's not. It's virtually non-existent. And then early 2000s, it was kind of a big deal. And the 70s, it kind of became a thing, but not really, It just really, once radio really got commercial, is at least for me, is when this started to become a phenomenon. Nobody talks about 1 or 2 hit wonders in the 50s because the records were so easy and disposable to make. So I think that's part of it too.
And it's interesting on that note, Rob, you mentioned now, and I think the climate of downloading and the fact that you can have songs that hit number 1 because of listens on Spotify or downloads from Apple Music or what have you. To your point, it has made the single irrelevant. There are still songs that a label will push.
Right.
But in theory,
anything can be a hit.
I mean, you can have someone like, I guess Taylor Swift is probably a good example, where 10 tracks suddenly all chart at once. Exactly. Ed Sheeran does that a lot as well. And that kind of, I think, reduces the potential now for a 2 or 3 hit wonder. If someone puts out a phenomenal album that really hits the zeitgeist at the right time, all those songs are going to chart at once, which is very, very different from the singles dominated era that you just mentioned of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s.
And Rob, back to your 70s point, there's a couple bands too that I was surprised that didn't have more hits. So, for example, Redbone with "Come and Get Your Love," which you would just, again, a nonstop airplay song, hit like number 5 on the charts, and also "The Witch Queen of New Orleans." I mean, that to me they were sort of omnipresent. Yet that's pretty much all they charted with. And same thing with a band called Stealers Wheel with "Stuck in the Middle with You," which of course got a sort of resurgence with the what was the movie with John Travolta? Oh my God, I'm blanking out. But anyway, and "Star." So that was their other single. So you find these bands that don't have as much as you thought they might have back then. Also, it's sort of like on the opposite end of the spectrum,
I'm curious. Through a lot of the 2000s in Britain, our equivalent of American Idol, which was the X Factor, really pushed out every year a new winner who would go on to chart on 2 or 3 occasions, and then that would be pretty much all you hear of them. Was that the same deal with American Idol here, or did they tend to go on to be a lot more successful?
I think not many. Like Carrie Underwood, of course, is huge. Jennifer Hudson, she does the talk show. What's her name?
Kelly Clarkson.
Kelly. I mean, amazing. I love her. Yeah. But I don't. And of course, there was a few that didn't, win the show, but that went on to have successful careers. Actually, I don't think Jennifer Hudson won. I'm not sure. But
I didn't even know she was on the show, to be honest.
Oh, really? Yeah. I think, I believe it was American Idol, one of those shows, but I don't think, I think you might be right where they didn't have them, success after success. May I speak about Delicious Vinyl, the label that I kind of worked through Island Records? Because I have a couple,
Absolutely.
Like I want to take it in the rap direction for a second. When I was at Island in 1988 and 89, we distributed the Delicious Vinyl label, which was started by Mike Ross and Matt Dyke in 87 as an indie label. And Island just distributed them for a while. And I just absolutely loved that whole experience of working Tone Loc, who had Wild Thing and Funky Cold Medina. Both of those were massive hits. And also Young MC with Bust a Move and Principal's Office. I mean, that was just such a great time. And that they had a sort of lightness about their rapping and their songs that was sort of like things were moving in a pretty heavy way, like Public Enemy in that genre, and I mean, NWA wasn't really massive at that point, but so I think this was a more lighthearted kind of whole experience. And I don't know really why they didn't have more success after that, but they didn't. Those were both of their 2 really popular songs. So
yeah, I think that's interesting as well. And then I'm going to throw out a couple more as well. A couple of these really surprised me when I started digging around too. I had thought of Wang Chung on my own because they had Dance All Days, and then they had To Live and Die in LA, which the score and the soundtrack for that is fantastic. But then they had that huge record with Let's Go and Everybody Have Fun Tonight, and then they just literally vanished from the face of the earth, right? They couldn't get a hit between To Live and Die in LA and Everybody Have Fun Tonight, right? But then after those 2 singles, they couldn't go anywhere, right? And I think that's a case of they might have been too British. I just think that people just didn't, I don't know. So they were one I thought of. Another one that kind of is surprising is Garbage, because they had Stupid Girl and Only Happy When It Rains, right? But their catalog of albums is fantastic. And every time they go on tour, people get excited and they sell well, So I think they're definitely an artist that's in there. And, again, falling into artists that we totally forgot about is Ugly Kid Joe with the cover of they did Cats in the Cradle. That's it. And then Everything About You, right?
Yeah.
Which also surprised me. I mean, I don't think anybody looks upon Ugly Kid Joe, though, and thinks, wow, these guys should have been huge, right? They're kind of like the Offspring before the Offspring were the Offspring. They're kind of just like this disposable party band.
Yeah.
That had 2 hits and they're done, but everyone thought they'd have 1, but they ended up having 2. So. Yeah,
that reminds me of a little bit of like, not Ugly Kid Joe, but more of Garbage. Till Tuesday, which of course voices Carrie, but then they also had What About Love in 1986. Now, of course, Amy Mann went on to crazy amazing albums, and she still has an amazing career to this day. So it's not surprising that maybe Till Tuesday, whatever, they broke up and she went on to a solo career. So you can't say, what about, why didn't they have more hits? She did, she continued. So,
and in the same vein, the Hooters with, and We Danced, and they had, the zombie song, right? All You Zombies or whatever.
Yeah.
But then that band, he pretty much realized this isn't going to work. So he became a songwriter and wrote a bunch of hits for everybody else.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is even more interesting, right? When you get that, because it's clearly someone who can write.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, in that case, he as the person in the band wasn't working out, or the rest of the band wasn't working out.
I'm also fascinated with people that are like absolutely friggin' huge, and then like the bottom drops out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like Corey Hart, for example, because he had Never Surrender and Sunglasses at Night, he was like everywhere.
Yes, he
Right?
was.
And he had, I think, a mild hit single with, how do I remember this stuff? A mild hit with Boy in the Box, right? But after that, nothing. But he has gone on to write a bunch of other songs, I think, for other people as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that's kind of fascinating that, you know, they just sort of know, okay, I'm giving up the ghost. And I wonder if some of this is also, are they just fed up with the business of it, right? Like they put out an album, they worked hard to make an album. They just didn't like how the label experience was, or the stress of trying to have a hit single, that they just decided to write songs. Or it also could be that there's more money in writing songs and doing the licensing than there is, you know, making records.
And then I think there are bands that kind of just hit at the wrong time, right? Their first few tracks hit the scene at just the right time, but then the scene moves on and they don't.
Exactly. Like there's a lot of disco examples for that. There was I was kind of like grouping them by genres in a way, some of them. And like if you're like late 70s, you know, you got like Sister Sledge with We Are Family and He's the Greatest Dancer, and then boom, bye. Taste of Honey, Boogie Oogie Oogie. I can't even say it. Boogie Oogie Oogie and Sukiyaki, and then bye. Silver Convention, Fly Robin Fly, and Get Up and Boogie, and then also Van McCoy with The Hustle and The Shuffle. I mean, those are just examples of the genre just went poof, goodbye. You know?
I haven't thought about the shuffle in a long time.
Yeah. But
wow.
I was also thinking about that with metal, because there was definitely like our show with Tom kind of had a lot of examples of bands. You know, it's funny too. There's bands that you think that were so massive, like Judas Priest. They are so massive, but they only charted really with Another Thing Coming and Heading Out to the Highway, here at least. You know, but their catalog is massive.
And the irony with Priest is, I think in the UK, they probably only charted with Breaking the Law and what's the other one from that album?
Oh, did Breaking the Law chart here? Maybe it did.
I don't think it did.
Yeah.
I think it was only Heading Out to the Highway and You Got Another Thing Coming. But there were two from British Steel that charted pretty well in the UK. And after that, similar story. They kind of dropped off a bit.
How about Quiet Riot? I mean, here they charted with Bang Your Head and Come On, Feel the Noise. But were they more popular in the UK? Do you remember, Anthony? Or
I don't think they. I mean, I wasn't.
Yeah, I know
around,
you weren't even around, but
but no, I don't think they were. I think Quiet Riot are interesting because they were almost a victim of their own success in that they opened the door for that entire scene, and then everyone else, the Motley Crues and what have you, effectively overtook them.
100%, 100%.
And you know, there would be no Motley Crue if Quiet Riot hadn't broken big.
And Twisted Sister, you know, they were around the same time. So like,
who I think you could also argue fit in this category with
We're Not Gonna
Ain't Gonna Take It No More and I Wanna Rock.
Yep. And they kind of had a hit with Leader of the Pack, but not really. It was like in the top 50. That's, you know.
Yeah.
And
we are talking about 3-hit wonders as well, so they're still in scope.
Yeah, they're in the scope. They're in the scope. So is Skid Row. Speaking of that, just in that genre, because they had huge, massive success with 18 in Life and Youth Gone Wild in 89. And then I Remember You was also pretty massive. But then, you know.
And I think with that scene, and this comes back to the interview we did with Tom, it was just so saturated.
Yes.
That unless you were at the top of it, like Motley Crue were, you were competing with everyone else for, you know, effectively second best at any given time, which meant most of them got their moment in the spotlight, but it was just a couple of tracks.
And again, I think that too was sort of a very disposable time where like, okay, we're going to work this band and then put them away, you know, and then the next thing comes, right? It was very much a recycler. Anthony, circling back to what you said about bands falling out of the times, I really think in the 80s that this idea of, you know, the Cold War really shifted everything, because like you had Frankie Go to Hollywood, which was huge with Two Tribes and relax. And then the Cold War ends and they can't really, or is ending, and they can't really recover, right? And they break up, and the second album is just kind of a mess. And then you've got, a lot of bands like ABC with Poison Arrow and Look of Love. And even though they had How to Be a Millionaire, right? They like the idea of like excess and greed and glam of the early 80s was very much disappearing in vogue in the mid 80s. So a lot of these bands were trying to find their footing and doing other things later. And I think the mid 80s and the mid 90s, you had a lot of transition musically. So I think you have audiences trying to figure out what they're doing, right? You've got, for example, in, the 90s, you've got the very beginning of all those Manchester bands, and they're doing great.
Oh, yeah.
And then all of a sudden, Nirvana drops, who you could argue is in this group with Come As You Are.
They are in this group.
Then Nirvana drops, and then like all those bands got left in the dust, and they could have put out Sgt. Pepper and it wouldn't have mattered, right? So I think there is something to what you said, Anthony, about the time changing it as well.
And I think you see the same thing happening in the early 2000s, both pre and then post 9/11. I think the 90s were a time of huge optimism. Then 9/11 happens in 2001.
Yep. Things got real serious.
Yeah. And suddenly, the socio-political atmosphere is different. And of course, that has an impact on music.
Yes.
And I think there were a number of artists who were really starting to hit their stride in, 2000 and the first half of 2001. And suddenly the floor falls away from them. I'm thinking, potentially Dido is a good example of that.
Yes, she's a perfect example. And, Dido was everywhere because she had a song and a couple soundtracks, and she was on a label that really worked her record. So that makes sense.
And she had that track with Eminem that really got her in the spotlight as well.
I'm going to throw it back way to the 80s, though, to a lighthearted time, because there's so many bands that I could have picked, I feel like, from this era. But there's just a few that you think that were so massive but then just fell away, which Flock of Seagulls, they had Iran, Space Age Love Song, and Wishing. And then there's probably pretty much just like goodbye. The Motels, which is sort of upsetting because I really loved Martha's voice and writing. But I think only The Lonely and Suddenly Last Summer were the only two singles that they really had that did well, really.
Yeah.
And I was also thinking about the Greg Kihn band because, I hated them, but they had massive success with the Breakup Song and Jeopardy and then Lucky. And again, then that was pretty much it. So, and a band I really liked who I thought they should have had more success after what they had was the Romantics. Well, they had What I Like About You and Talking in Your Sleep. And I don't know. They didn't, I think they had a lot of internal strife too, and things were going on with band members and maybe label stuff too.
They were on my list too, as is Scandal, because they had, The Warrior and Goodbye to You. And then I think Love's Got a Line. They had like three. Yeah, they were another band too. That's just sort of like, these guys are great. And they got sort of
that's a band I wasn't crazy about when they were out, but when I think of, I love her now. I mean, she was so super talented, and she had quite a bit of solo success, after that. But again, that band broke up not only because of internal issues, but they also had some record company issues too.
Mm-hmm.
You know what's a band that really fascinates me that they had a huge success in the 70s and then a huge success in the 80s is Golden Earring. They had a hit in 1973 with Radar Love. And then in 1982, they had Twilight Zone. And it was like totally two different genres of music, really. And they managed to have a massive success like 9 or 10 years later with another song. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think that is kind of interesting too, how spaced out it was.
Yeah.
The same thing with the Human League, right? Because you had Don't You Want Me, and then years later you had Human, right? Which also did really well.
Which is such a good song.
But in England, I mean, the amount of Human League singles that are regarded as classic or, important singles is huge, right?
And even here in my own mind, like Fascination is great. Like, there's so many songs that I would think that's why it was hard to pick on this list. I was thinking, because when I was listening to these albums, wow, it was like I thought every song was a hit when I was young like that, you know, but they weren't.
Even Tears for Fears, because they had Shout, and then they had Sowing the Seeds of Love, and then really Everybody Wants to Rule the World. And then Head Over Heels kind of did okay, but it didn't do super great. But they were kind of in that thing too, where they had a run of like a year or 2 years with Big Chair, and then Sowing the Seeds was everywhere.
And I think with them, you know, something like Mad World only really got lots of recognition, you know, 2004 or whenever it was, when the cover version that was on the Donnie Darko soundtrack showed up.
Which is funny, because to me, that was, you know, in my mind at 18 years old or whatever, that was a huge hit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
I did want to hone in on what you said, Rob, about bands who were big in the UK, because obviously this is something that's near and dear to my heart. And looking at various lists as I was doing research for this episode, I was like, oh, but they were huge back home.
Yeah.
You know, All Saints, who were kind of the mature, slightly more grown-up version of the Spice Girls, at least that's how they were marketed. Massive. I mean, every track they put out from their first couple of albums back home was huge. And as I'm looking them up here, it seemed that it was like just like two or three.
Yeah, something like that.
I think I Know Where It's At and Never Ever. Which is just wild to me, because I think of them as being massive, and on this side of the pond they just weren't.
Yeah, there. So that we were talking about earlier in the episode, then Bananarama, that I think would fall into that category too, right? Because here they really, Cruel Summer was huge in '83. Venus went to number 1 in '85 on the charts here, and then I Heard a Rumor was their only other charting one. I believe it was '86.
Yeah.
How many people here would equally recognize some of their other songs, like, you know, Na Na Hey Hey Kiss and Goodbye?
Would, but
yeah. And like I loved Robert De Niro's Waiting when that thing came out, right? And that just kind of came out and didn't go anywhere, but it set the table for, you know.
Well, that's why I was shocked when I was doing the research for them, because I really thought they would not fit in this category, and again in the UK they wouldn't, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, but and this is the thing that happens with a lot of the Stock Aitken Waterman bands, is they have like 2, maybe 3 hits and they're done. Because you had Bananarama, and then you had Rick Astley with Never Gonna Give You Up, and then Together Forever, and then really not much else after that, right? Another thing I want to put out there too, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, is only if he would have listened to other people and not himself, Terrence Trent D'Arby would have been absolutely huge.
He's on my list too, yeah.
Because Wish Me Well was fantastic. Sign Your Name was great. He could have easily just had a really incredible career, and he just completely blew it.
What was the deal with him? What happened? Why did he?
He was, he didn't like the producer. He didn't like the label, and nobody likes their producer and their label. And I get that, right? But he just didn't really listen to any other suggestions for the second album, right? He just knew what he wanted to do, and that was it. And, you know, there are hundreds of cases where, like, you hear an album and the first song on side A and the first song on side B are sort of like, you know, screw you, here's your singles, here's the rest of the album I wanted to make, right? He didn't even do that. So that's a case of self-sabotage. And then also Lisa and Cult Jam. Yes. Because they had Lost in Emotion, and then that incredibly friggin' catchy Head to Toe that was just like,
oh my God,
so painfully catchy that it still rings through, you know. And New Shoes, same thing. Point of No Return and I Can't Wait, right? Like that whole little block of 80s.
And
stuff
also into the 90s, like The Time, like with Jungle Love and that.
I was just about,
so a lot of them, like Sheila E. and stuff like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Rob, you raised an interesting point with Rick Astley, because some of these artists are technically 2 or 3 hit wonders, but their other songs have almost faded into obscurity, even though they were hits at the time. My generation, for example, only knows Rick Astley for Never Gonna Give You Up. Yet he clearly had another hit because you mentioned it, and candidly, I'd never even heard of it. So there are definitely artists here who fit this category, but are still really now only remembered for one song, and would tend to be. I would have labeled Rick Astley as a one-hit wonder because I didn't know.
Well, I almost didn't know though. You know, the second Rick. I mean, there's a few bands that I like. I had that too on my list, like Jesus Jones. You only remember them for Right Here, Right Now, right? But Real, Real, Real was really popular, and the Rembrandts. If you think about I'll Be There for You, but they had a big hit in 1990 with Just the Way It Is, Baby. So. Yes, there are bands that you think are one-hit wonders, but they aren't.
And I'm thinking Natalie Imbruglia is another example of that. You know, Torn, and then she had Wishing I Was There. Nobody remembers Wishing I Was There.
No.
Yeah. But then you have, you know, bands that have like a huge back catalog, like Erasure. And they have Chains of Love and A Little Respect that chart, but then nothing. But their catalog is like incredibly dense, right? Or even Dead or Alive with, again, Stock Aitken Waterman. You've got You Spin Me Around and you've got Brand New Lover, but they had like, I think Youthquake had like 5 singles off of it, right?
And it's a shame with a band like Dead or Alive, because after that, they just relied on endless remixes of You Spin Me Round, and that was their only output after about 1996.
Well, that's just their fault.
but they knew they had a hit.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, milk it for all it's worth.
But speaking of established bands that you know they have huge back catalogs, I'm thinking Talking Heads.
Yes.
You know, I was surprised to see them on lists. I was surprised to see The Cure, given how utterly iconic they are.
I had thought about them too, because basically just like Heaven and Love Song are the two big chart hits, right?
And Friday I'm in Love.
Yeah, which is a little later. Yeah.
I guess. I mean, I it's funny. Again, that's another band that I would not have thought when I saw them on those lists. I was like, no, that can't be, because every song's a hit.
Or even a band with absolute fucking superstars like Cream. Right. They would fit on this list with Sunshine of Your Love and White Room and maybe Crossroads. But suddenly they're thought of as an absolutely legendary band, but they only had 2 or 3 hits.
Yeah.
And I think only 1 album.
And, you know, the Fine Young Cannibals had an amazing first album, right? And they're only really remembered for the Raw and the Cooked with Good Thing and She Drives Me Crazy, right? And maybe later Don't Ask Me to Choose. But they put out a really dense 2 catalog career, and then got really smart with all their licensing.
If you're lucky, I will sing the chorus to She Drives Me Crazy later.
If you're lucky. If we're lucky. We're going to hold you that we're going to hold you to that. I want to name a band that sort of like burned bright and then really kind of disappeared, which is the Knack. They were so hot in the late 70s and in like 1980 with My Sharona and Good Girls Don't and Baby Talks Dirty. I mean, it was ubiquitous on the radio. And then they were gone. And another band that I never liked, but I feel like they should have done more. Maybe they did. Maybe the lead singer did afterwards. I'm not sure. But Mr. were so popular with Broken Wings and Kyrie, and then Is It Love? I think it was called, and it was like 80. It was like right after that, right after the 2 huge hits in 85. But I don't know. I think I don't even know the lead singer's name, to be honest. But he had a great voice, and I feel like he could have gone on to bigger and better things. Maybe he did. Can you imagine if he's like one of the songwriters of all time, and I'm just like, who's that guy? But
I mean, certainly they have such a legacy. They even get name checked by Train on that god awful song that Train did.
Oh no!
I'd like to not think about Train.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought about them, so you had to as well. This is when I get banned from ever hosting a show again.
You could also argue about the Bangles, because you had Manic Monday and Walk Like an Egyptian. Even though Lazy
Flame.
Yeah, well, and Lazy, and there's also Lazy Shade, so maybe not.
No, but we're 2 or 3 hit wonders. I mean,
Yeah, but again, a band with a much deeper catalog than what they should have.
Oh yeah, their
Oh,
catalog
I mean,
is crazy.
and this is an example of an album-orientated band, but with an insane catalog. Pink Floyd.
Oh,
Yeah.
You got Money and you've got Another Brick in the Wall Part 2. And then the rest of their catalog's incredible, but those are the only two songs that ever really charted.
When did Money chart? When did that chart? What year was that?
73.
Right, and that's another interesting example, sort of like Golden Earring, right? 73, and then no, Brick in the Wall was like
1980.
80, yeah, okay. Still.
So 7 years.
Yeah. Quite a distance between having one massive hit and then another massive hit. And that's it being a massive hit,
Yeah, and there really should be an investigation into The Hague, into Men Without Hats and Pop Goes the World. And
in a good way or in a why do they even exist way?
It's like, it is truly one of the most hideously lyrical songs ever written. I mean, the melody's really catchy, right? But like, if you have to wonder why you have to dress your drummer up like a snowman to get people to watch your band, one, and then you cry that you can't get any hits, well, that might have something to do with it. But the lyrics are just friggin' terrible, right? So yes, where you had like this interesting progressive chord change stuff going on in the Safety Dance and some interesting melody stuff. And then you get almost 10 years later or whatever with Pop Goes the World. It's like, come on.
I don't know, Rob. You can dance if you want to, my friend.
That record is fantastic, even though that thing has been released 10,000 times as well. But it's sort of like, you have it would be better to be a band known for one great hit than one really great hit and then complete another shite as your second hit in the two-hit wonder one, right?
Speaking of one great hit, and then they did have another hit, but the one thing that they're remembered for, I think, Extreme with More Than Words. And then they had from that same album, I believe it was Wholehearted, which charted at number 4. I mean, More Than Words was number 1, of course, that is, I know it's cheesy and blah, 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 whatever, but if you just sit down and listen to that song, it's beautiful. The lyrics are beautiful, and the song is really just produced well and just so simplistic but so heartfelt. And as a matter of fact, I was sort of researching that because I was thinking, like, wouldn't that be a nice song to cover in just a different way, and how would that be done? But I then was researching it, and so many people have covered that song that it's just, it's not to be bothered with, But
so I will see your Extreme and raise you a Nelson. Who had nowhere the career of the father.
Like that.
I mean, I'm not a big Nelson fan, so I'll
who is, right? You wanted examples. I didn't say it'd be pretty. It's like Nam. There's going to be flashbacks.
I mean, I think Extreme, Nelson, I mean, they all fit into the hair metal scene, which, it comes back to you had the big players and then everyone else got their moments in the sun. And it almost goes back to what you were saying about the Stock Aitken Waterman stuff, Rob, right? Where they all got their brief moments in the spotlight before it got shifted onto someone else.
And I'm glad to say, too, that I'm gleefully and happily putting the Red Hot Chili Peppers in this camp.
No.
Because you've got Under the Bridge, you've got Californication and Give It Away, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they can't catch that lightning in a bottle again after that.
Yeah, I guess not.
See, they're one of those bands I think of as being absolutely massive, mostly because they just were in the UK. I mean...
But they didn't get... I mean, as big as Blood Sugar Sex Magic was, that band did not live up to the hypes that their label had, and especially up the album after it. They thought they were going to be like bigger, which is just weird.
Yeah, I mean, I think bizarrely they really hit a peak in the UK in the early 2000s. I mean, between Californication and By the Way, all of the tracks off of those two albums were stratospheric, and even Danny California from Stadium Arcadium did really well. And because of that, I make the assumption that they were just as popular in America with those albums, and when I actually look at how they charted, they weren't. And that's one of those ones that I was talking about earlier, where there's just such a disconnect in my head.
Yeah. And it's funny because for that band, I think of them more when I was like teenager into my 20s, and how I used to go see them all the time. And they were, to me, in my mind, they were huge, but they didn't really hit big until later. So that's a funny, different perspective, isn't it?
In like 2003, I think it was, they played 2 headline shows 2 nights running in Hyde Park, where they were supported by James fucking Brown.
Wow.
Admittedly, that was James Brown past his peak, but I mean,
Still.
they were huge in the UK in the 2000s.
Isn't that funny? Because they both, James Brown and Chili Peppers, both were on the Woodstock show that we did our episode on too, and that just
I wonder if they became friends there.
Yeah.
I also, as much as this is weird to say too, is I would put Devo in here, because you had Whip It, Girl You Want, and Dr. Detroit, and really outside of that, on commercial radio in America, they just got abandoned.
Yet if you think about their play on MTV, like We're Through Being Cool and all of us, Satisfaction. I mean, that's another thing. Another aspect of it was MTV. So to think of it when of a band, maybe they didn't get massive airplay, but if they were all over MTV, I'm saying that we as young kids or, teenagers, 20s, we would know about it, right? Maybe it wasn't a huge radio hit though, but that's why I think some things in my mind were bigger than they were on radio, and maybe weren't split ends.
For me, I didn't have access to MTV for years. I had to go to somebody else's house and watch it. So, and I was one of these people that always listened to the top 40 charts just to sort of learn new stuff. And, I would go to Walgreens or Woolworths and buy 45s.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes, kids, Walgreens and Woolworths used to sell 45s. Ask your parents.
I mean, I think like an example of that is Blue Oyster Cult, because I don't think they would have been, I don't think Don't Fear the Reaper and Burning for You would have been as big of hits for them if they weren't on MTV every 2 fucking seconds in the beginning of MTV, because MTV didn't have videos to play. But they had Blue Oyster Cult and they had April Wine and they had, the bands like that.
What was really funny on British music television in like the late 90s was they would often try and be trendsetters with bands, particularly on like the manufactured pop scene. So clearly some manager or label or promoter would pay them a bunch of money to play this song on repeat in the hope that the band would make it big. And I'm going to drift off topic here, but it's funny because I'm going to talk about a no-hit wonder. I remember them very clearly really pushing a band called Email, which was a boy group, and their song literally went, we are email, we just can't fail. Guess what?
Ew.
They failed. Anyway, that's my off-topic story on no-hit wonders. Let's get back on topic.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting how music TV could really propel some of these, and if MTV or eventually rival channels didn't promote the follow-ups, they would fall into this 2-3 hit wonder category because of that.
I mean, going back to the 70s too, you had Grand Funk Railroad with We're an American Band and the Locomotion, and they're getting ready to tour now, and they're selling out.
Wow. And do you think someone like Vanilla Ice would have been I mean, maybe he would have. That song really was. But he had he had 2 singles, so he was in that category of 2-hit wonders. He had Play That Funky Music and Ice Ice Baby, but I don't know. Would he have been so huge had it not been for MTV also?
Well, I think that he's in the same boat as the Delicious Vinyl folks that you had, right? Because a lot of those records that they did with Delicious Vinyl wouldn't have gotten anywhere without MTV and the videos. I mean, Tone Loc and Young MC did really smart videos, and that's why people remember them. Yeah,
like the Bust a Move video, so cute. Yeah.
Yeah, interestingly, we haven't really touched on the whole kind of hip hop and urban scene, but that's pretty ripe for 1 and 2 and 3 hit wonders, I think, because you really look over the last 20 years and so much of what's popular musically has shifted into that genre, and you get a lot of those artists that a label will push and then just drop. Or you have someone like Lauryn Hill, who I think had 2 solo hits before it was all over.
Right.
Or Delight.
Yeah. Well, that's
Yeah.
not really, but yes, I mean, I know what you're saying, right? Mm-hmm.
And I think that is just a function of rappers are everywhere right now, and they can't all be absurdly popular. They can't all be Eminem or Dr. Dre.
Yeah.
Right.
No.
50 Cent. For every Eminem, you're going to have a Soulja Boy. Or you're going to have 3 Soulja Boys for every Eminem.
Yes, you are. I was thinking, you made me think of the R&B stuff too, like En Vogue, those bands, that had few massive hits. But then, of course, people that went off, and of course, Beyonce is the hugest thing in the world, but those kind of bands in that era too, just some of the 1 and 2, 3 hit wonders of that kind of genre too. There was plenty of them.
I mean, you got Rockwell, you've got like Culture Beat, you've got like just, God, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
I guess the only question is, do you think now, in the days of streaming, and this is to kind of take the conversation full circle, will 2 or 3 hit wonders continue to be a thing? Or do you think that in the modern music environment, we're now in a position where people latch onto something, become huge fans of it, and if it ever gets popular enough, they're going to still latch on to future material? Is the 2 or 3 hit wonder phenomenon over?
I think that one of the things that sort of puts this whole question into an interesting context is the surge in vinyl sales, because people aren't buying vinyl to hear 1 or 2 songs. They're buying vinyl to hear full albums.
Yeah.
So if we use that as the template, then yes, right? I think we're not going to see this again. But then looking at streaming, I think we're definitely might see it again, because people have the super short attention spans and they only want to hear 2 or 3 songs on an album, and then they're done. When you look at an artist like, whatever their radio thing is on Spotify, it's got like 2 or 3 songs by the artist, and then everything else is other people that are on their label or whatever. So I think that the industry has sort of shifted to getting an artist 2 or 3 singles, and if the 3rd single, if they're not platinum, they move on.
So you're saying we might see even more?
I think
as we move past this era.
Well, it's tricky, because I think if the people that collect vinyl win, no, but I think the people that stream win, then yes. It's a sort of this double-edged sword that I'm kind of wrestling with. I think that we're going to see more people that just have 1 song, 2 song, or 3 songs that are popular, mainly because people have such a crazy attention span. Like Katy Perry was huge 10 years ago, but now she's almost an afterthought, right? Which is kind of sad.
Well, on the flip side, you have Taylor Swift, who is just continuing to produce mega hit after mega hit, and is probably, alongside Ed Sheeran, the most popular artist in the world right now.
Yeah.
It's interesting how some artists people really latch onto, and to your point, Rob, the attention span wonders with others. And I wonder what that oomph for those mega stars is. I mean, personally, I can't stand Ed Sheeran, and I don't understand why he's such a big hit. Yeah. I mean, I would, from my perspective, I think he had 1 song that I particularly liked, and I would love it if he had been a 1-hit wonder, but there are so many people out there who do enjoy him.
Yeah, I know, that's pretty nuts. I don't think that, I don't know if we can predict that, to your main question. Rob had a good point there with the vinyl and stuff, but I mean, I also want to know who the people buying the vinyl are. I mean, is it mostly older people, or are kids now buying vinyl? Is that a thing now for younger
kids
people?
Buying vinyl's a thing.
Yeah. Okay. So, well.
Yeah. I mean, by the time I hit my teenage years, vinyl was done, and I buy vinyl now.
Yeah.
Admittedly, my vinyl buying habits, very rarely do I buy a new album on vinyl. I have certain artists that I truly, truly adore, and I work to get their entire back catalog on vinyl, and I will buy a new record by them
Okay, so
when
you're
it comes
searching
out on
bins,
vinyl.
basically.
But-
You're going back for like the catalog.
Well, I'm even buying, new press.
Mhm.
Now if I take Iron Maiden, their 80s albums get a vinyl repress every couple of years.
Right.
And as bands do these remixes, remasters of their old albums, they put them out on vinyl again, and I tend to pick those kind of special and deluxe editions up.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think we've had a really, really good and robust conversation on 2 and 3 hit wonders. We would love, dear listener, to hear your thoughts on this. So head to our social media pages, comment on the post that links to this episode. We would love to hear your thoughts. What are some of your favorite 2 and 3 hit wonders? We're going to take a very brief break. Wow, that's a little bit of a tongue twister. And then we'll be back with our picks of the week. So stay tuned.
Do you like podcasts?
Then you're gonna hate Thunder Talk.
Tasteless subject matter,
mature humor, contempt for our co-hosts,
unapologetic social views,
edgy music,
and total irreverence for the nerd junk we love
are all reasons why no one
should listen to Thunder Talk.
Find us on the ESO network
and all podcasting platforms. Or don't.
Whatever.
And we're back. Time for picks of the week. And this time round, let's kick off with you, Rob.
So I think before we jump into that, I'm going to just sort of say that I've spent most of today, when we record this, listening to the music of Ryuichi Sakamoto, who passed away this morning. Well, actually March 28th, but it was announced today, the day that we're recording this. And he's an interesting artist because he won 2 Golden Globes, he won a Grammy, he won a BAFTA, and he won an Oscar, right? But his work on the scores for like Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence is the thing he's going to be remembered for, as well as The Last Emperor and The Revenant. Like, he did the scores for all those. He's this artist that had tremendous influence over electronica as a member of Yellow Moon Orchestra, right? And that band's a huge influence on bands like Sparks, for example, right? Mm-hmm. His 1980 album B2 Unit, that thing is like regarded as the classic of early electronica, and he made a song called Riot in Lagos that has sort of like been pinged by people that do electronica and hip hop as like an influential record of the time. So just an amazing actor, composer, and musician. Collaborated with nearly everybody. I mean, obviously David Sylvian's the one people talk about, but also as to camera, Brian Wilson, David Byrne, Iggy Pop, Adrian Belew, Laurie Anderson, so just an interesting and prolific artist. So I've been listening to a lot of his records today, just to kind of, remember, it's like, oh man, these records are great. And I completely forgot about that. The other things I've been listening to, this week is the 30th anniversary of the release of the first Suede album. Ooh, so I've been listening to that a lot.
30? Oh God.
Yeah. And then also, if you want a little bit of angst in your world, there's a band from Manchester called Ist, I-S-T-I-S-T. And, they're kind of in the same vein as like Gang of Four, the Idols, sort of like really like heavy post-punk kind of stuff. Also, I want to recommend the new Depeche Mode album, Memento Mori, which is really, really dark. And I did not think that they would make their best record in 2 decades after somebody in their band died. But in that instance, minimalism and toning down the flash has really worked for them. So that's great. And then lastly, a film that's coming out in wide circulation called Who the Hell Are Blood, Sweat, and Tears, right? Mm. And basically it's about Blood, Sweat, and Tears touring behind the Iron Curtain in 1970. And they were the first Western band to play behind the Iron Curtain. And they've got, Americans pissed at them for playing behind the Iron Curtain, despite the fact they were invited by the State Department, right? Then they've got, the Soviet bloc watching them, and they have like fans that are coming up to meet them and get their autographs, and like the cops are just pummeling them.
Wow.
Right?
That sounds interesting.
And
wow.
the band, and I know nothing about Blood, Sweat, and Tears, really, but like just listening to the band talk about what happened to them and the experience of it. And it's one of those moments where politics meets music that is incredibly profound. And since we spend a lot of time talking about the 70s and sort of music of the times, that also does tie into that as well.
Wow, that sounds like a good one.
Yeah.
Very cool. 30 years for that first Suede album. That's crazy.
But it still holds up, man. That thing's still...
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, their first 3 albums, for me, are just works of genius anyway. All right, Steph, what have you got this week?
I have 2 things, and one is going to shock you a little bit, but I'll go with my first pick, which is my friend Dana Athens from the band Jane Lee Hooker, who are amazing. She just released a new single on March 31st called In My Bones. It is, her voice is like it's like butter. Like it's rockin', but it's like soulful, and it cuts through everything in the most beautiful way. So Jane Lee Hooker a little bit more rockin', but Dana's solo tracks kind of have a more like almost gospel kind of poppier feel to them. And this is just like this song really showcases her voice so well. It's like a soaring vocal. Her lyrics are really uplifting, and like you can listen to her and you just feel like joy radiating from her. And it's so, I just love her so much. One cool thing about this track is that her dad played piano and keys on the song. And I think it's so cool that she included her father. So Dana's going to have a full length record later in the year, but she's going to have one more single in May and one more single in July. You could find her on her website, which is just danaathens.com, but also on like Spotify and iTunes and everything. And all the social media is just under Dana Athens. So please check out In My Bones, because really it's so fabulous. And she also has a song called Peace, Love, and Shine that she released a few years ago that is absolutely gorgeous too. So that's pick number 1. Pick number 2 is a happy accident choice that I was trying to figure out where we could post the Tony Levin episode. Yes, we did interview Tony Levin a couple episodes ago, people. Check that out. And I ran on the internet. I ran into someone who runs is an admin for the Australian Chapman stick player site, and his name is Justin Levis. I hope I'm saying that right, Justin. He's in a band called Reckless Collusion. After a long discussion with him, we discovered each other were in bands. His band is Reckless Collusion, and they are pretty much prog rock, Anthony. And I loved every song I heard. I watched and heard 8 songs of theirs on YouTube. I guess if I had to pick my favorites, I would say Axis, Ghosts, and Clouds Over the Asylum are like my favorites, but they're all really cool. The videos are super cool, and they have like, they got like random people in them that they feature, and they have like sort of these, it's almost like a transy dance element to their songs too, which I absolutely love. And the vocals are really kind of low key. So they kind of like, it's a really good juxtaposition with the rockier kind of sounds of the band. So, and you'll be interested to know that on one of their songs called Kryptonite, Pat Mastelotto is on drums. And is it Marcus Reuter or Reuter? Does anybody know from Tony's band?
No clue.
I'm not sure. If I'm saying that wrong, I'm sorry. But he's on guitar on that song. But other than that, it's Justin and this other the other guy is named Andrew Jones. So check out Reckless Collusion. You can find them on YouTube, but Bandcamp also.
Yeah, they're definitely on my list to check out, and I'll be giving them some.
Yes, I think you'd like
time on my playlist this week.
They describe themselves. I mean, he was sort of describing himself as a mix between like Porcupine Tree and a hint of like Carnival and Cog, which are these other prog rock bands from Australia. So
very cool, and that's the perfect segue into what I've been listening to, because I just got a TV in my home office, which has meant while I've been working, I've been watching a few concert DVDs. And particular shout out, of course, to my boys in Porcupine Tree. Their 2 concert releases, Arriving Somewhere and Anesthetize, have had some very heavy rotation this week. And if only it had some of the latest material, it would take me right back to that night in Radio City Music Hall.
Oh, yes.
beyond that, I have mostly been listening to a band called Church of the Cosmic Skull, who I am going to see play here in Atlanta in 2 nights' time, which by the time this goes out will be in the past. So by the time you listen to this, I will have seen them. But they've got 4 albums, and their whole shtick is they're a fake cult, right? So they act like they're this cult. They all dress in white. They're led by Brother Bill.
Oh my God, I need to see this.
Their albums are called, they've got Is Satan Real? Science Fiction, Everybody's Going to Die, and There Is No Time. And Everybody's Going to Die came out at the latter half of 2019, and I got a t-shirt with that on right at the beginning of 2020.
Oh my God, such bad timing.
And probably a month later, the pandemic hit, and I just went, I can't wear this t-shirt.
Are they prophets? No.
I will be wearing it on Tuesday night, though. So that's really what I've been listening to. It's been a lot of fun with both those and Church of the Cosmic Skull and the Porcupine Tree DVDs.
Ooh.
So with that, we're at the end of the show. Rob, where can everyone find you?
So you can find me on needcoffee.com and the Weekend Justice podcast. Also, you can find me Wednesdays on KDHX in St. Louis from 7 to 9 Central. It streams online at kdhx.org, and everything is archived for 2 weeks at kdhx.org. So if you're out buying a goat or something, you can listen later, however you want to do it. And then I also am about 6 episodes deep into my side hustle for Louder Than War Radio, Antics. It's on Mondays, 6 to 8 Greenwich Mean Time. So just adjust that to whatever works for you. And those are also archived on Mixcloud as well. If you want to hear that, the best thing you can do is listen to it on the Louder Than War webpage and get all the info on the Louder Than War Radio webpage on how to track that down and find it.
Awesome. Thank you, Rob. Steph, where can people find you?
Okay. Well, you can find me on Instagram at Stepanie. No, you can't find me there. You can find me on Instagram at there_r_birds. But you can find me on Facebook at Stepanie Seymour Music. You can find me on my website at therearebirds.com. And Bandcamp under my name, Stepanie Seymour. And of course, on all the streaming platforms everywhere, like Spotify, stuff like that.
Very cool. And do check both of my well-esteemed co-hosts out. Now, for the co-host who is not here this evening, our fearless leader, Alan Seiler, you can find him on a number of podcasts, including Earth Station Trek, Doctor Who, From Auton to Zygon, and Alan's Record Bin, as well as with various books and what have you that are published through Cosmic Creative. And you can find links to everything he does at cosmicpress.com. That's KOZMIC press.com. So go and check out the other things Alan does. And you can find me mostly here these days. I don't really do much else since my other podcast is on hiatus.
We love that you're here.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Stepanie. So with that, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We hope you've enjoyed listening to this as much as we have enjoyed talking about it. We'll be back with another exciting episode next time round where Alan will be back in the hot seat, thankfully. Mm-hmm. And until then, we'll see you next time. She drives me crazy.
I was going to just ask you.
Like no one else.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.